All right, so get this. You're going about your day making decisions, or so you think.
Right.
But what if your brain is secretly calling the shots milliseconds before you even know it?
Oh, absolutely.
That's the freaky territory we're diving into today with the Libet experiment.
It's a fascinating one.
You've sent in some seriously thought-provoking articles on this, and let me tell you, it makes you look at your morning coffee choice in a whole new light.
It really does make you question that whole "I meant to do that"
Yeah.
feeling we have, doesn't it?
Right.
Libet's work, while controversial, really kicked open the door on how we understand voluntary action and whether we're truly in control.
Okay, so for those just joining the party, what exactly was the bet looking at?
He was trying to pin down the sequence of events when we decide to move.
Okay.
We all have this subjective experience of like, I decided to move my arm and then it moved.
Right.
But Libet wanted to see what was happening in the brain during those fleeting moments.
So, like, is my conscious decision the starting pistol for my brain, or is there something firing up even earlier?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
And to measure this, he focused on a brain signal called the readiness potential, or RP for short.
Okay.
Think of it like a neuron party getting started. You might not hear the music consciously yet, but the brain's DJ is already setting the mood.
Okay, I'm following.
Yeah.
So we've got the brain warming up with this readiness potential, but how did Libet actually try to catch it in the act?
Yeah.
It's not like you can just ask someone, hey, when did your brain decide to wiggle your pinky?
You're right. It's not that simple.
Yeah.
Libet's experiment was surprisingly low-tech, considering the implications. He had people watch a clock face with a moving dot. Very retro. And their only task was to decide when to flick their wrist and note the dot's position when they felt the urge to move. Meanwhile, their brain activity was being monitored.
Sounds simple enough, but I'm guessing those clock-watching finger wigglers held the key to something much bigger.
Oh, absolutely. What Libet found sent ripples through the field of neuroscience. It turned out that the readiness potential, that brain party we talked about, was often showing up hundreds of milliseconds before people consciously felt they'd decided to move. It's like your brain booked the caterers before you even decided to throw the party.
Whoa, that's wild. So my brain is already making moves without me, the conscious CEO, even getting a memo. No wonder this caused such a stir.
Right.
You're telling me our brains might be sneakier than we thought.
It certainly seems that way. Of course, no good scientific finding goes unchallenged, and the Libet experiment is no exception.
All right, so what were some of the criticisms leveled at Libet's interpretation? I imagine those results had people crying foul, right?
You bet. One of the biggest issues raised was the reliance on memory.
Okay.
Remember, people had to recall precisely when they felt the urge to move. And our memories, especially for fleeting moments, aren't always the most reliable.
Yeah, I can barely remember what I had for breakfast. Trying to pinpoint the exact nanosecond I thought about moving my wrist? Forget about it.
Precisely. Critics argued that this reliance on subjective timing could have skewed the results, making the gap between brain activity and conscious decision seem larger than it really was.
Okay, so timing is a bit fuzzy. But what about the readiness potential itself? Were there other issues with linking that specifically to a conscious decision?
Yes. Just because a brain area lights up doesn't mean it's the root cause of a decision. Imagine using a flashlight to find your keys in a dark room.
Right.
Just because the flashlight illuminates the keys doesn't mean it made them magically appear there.
Right, yeah. That'd be a handy flashlight.
Right. The readiness potential might be more like the flashlight highlighting an upcoming action, but not necessarily the decision to act itself. And this brings us to a crucial point about the supplementary motor area, or SMA, where this RP signal originates.
All right, SMA, break it down for us. What's this brain region all about?
Well, this region isn't just about doing movements. It's also involved in planning and imagining them.
Okay.
So that readiness potential might just be your SMA doing some mental gymnastics, getting ready for a potential wrist flick without a firm decision in place yet.
So it's less move now, and more, movements on the table, better stretch and warm up, just in case.
Exactly. And studies have found that even thinking about a movement without actually doing it can trigger activity in the SMA, adding to the ambiguity of what the RP truly represents.
Okay.
It might be a general readiness for action, not a specific move your wrist now command.
Okay, so we've got some timing troubles and an identity crisis for the readiness potential. But before we dive into the free will debate this sparked, which is where things get really juicy.
This is where things get really interesting because even questioning that free will component kind of throws a wrench into how we view ourselves and
Right.
our place in the world.
Right. It's one thing for my brain to be quicker on the draw with a wrist flick, but are we saying bigger decisions are also pre-baked? That's getting into some deep philosophical water.
Exactly.
Mm.
And many argue that Libet's setup, while intriguing, wasn't designed to tackle the kind of morally laden, complex decisions
Right.
we usually associate with free will.
Right.
Deciding when to act on a whim
Right.
versus choosing your career path.
Yeah.
Those feel miles apart.
Well, totally. Like my brain picking up that cookie without asking me is one thing, but if it's silently steering my life choices, that's a whole other level of existential crisis.
Precisely. And even Libet himself acknowledged this limitation.
Oh, okay.
But the point is, his findings got the ball rolling. Scientists love a good mystery. So this sparked a whole wave of new research to address the criticisms and dig deeper into how our brains make choices.
So what came next? Did folks just throw out Libet's work and say, nice try, back to the drawing board? Or were there ways to build on it?
Oh, it definitely wasn't a dead end.
Yeah.
Researchers love a good challenge, and they saw this as an opportunity to refine methods, test new ideas, the whole scientific shebang.
Right.
One big shift was moving beyond those simple actions, the finger flicks,
Right.
the wrist wiggles,
Yeah.
and into more complex decision-making tasks.
Okay, so less move it or don't, and more scenarios where there's actual thinking involved.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Some studies had people choose between different options,
Okay.
say pressing a button with their left or right hand while their brain activity was monitored. This starts to get at that element of choice, right?
Yeah, now we're talking. It's like my brain isn't just acting on autopilot. It's weighing possibilities, just like it does when I'm trying to decide between the veggie burger or the fries.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And here's where it gets really wild. Some studies, using these more complex setups, found brain activity patterns reflecting which choice someone would eventually make,
Okay.
even before the person consciously reported making the decision.
Yeah.
It's like your brain is playing a game of subconscious chess several moves ahead of your conscious awareness.
Hold on. So even when I think I'm making a deliberate choice, my brain might have already laid the groundwork without me knowing. That's both fascinating and slightly terrifying.
Right.
It's like finding out your co-pilot has secretly been flying the plane this whole time.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. This doesn't necessarily mean our conscious minds are irrelevant.
Okay.
Remember, the brain is a master of efficiency.
Right.
It's constantly processing information, anticipating outcomes, and preparing for action, all below the level of conscious awareness.
So my brain is like a super efficient personal assistant, always one step ahead, booking those metaphorical flights and hotels before I've even decided on a destination.
Exactly. And while that might seem unnerving at first, think about how much mental energy we'd waste if we had to consciously deliberate over every tiny detail of our lives.
True. I mean, imagine if we had to consciously think about every single muscle involved in walking every time we took a step. We'd never get anything done.
Exactly. Our conscious minds are freed up to focus on the bigger picture, the more complex and nuanced decisions, while our unconscious processes handle the nitty-gritty details. It's a beautiful collaboration, really.
Okay, that makes me feel a bit better about my brain secretly running the show. But where does that leave us with all this talk about free will? If our brains are calling the shots before we're even aware, is free will just an illusion?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. Even among neuroscientists, there's a spectrum of views. Some believe these findings challenge the traditional notion of free will, suggesting that our conscious experience of making a choice might be more like a readout of a decision that's already been made.
So, like, free will is less about making choices and more about becoming aware of the choices our brain has already made. That's a bit of a head spinner.
It certainly is. But on the other end of the spectrum, some researchers argue that these findings don't negate free will at all. They suggest that consciousness might still play a crucial role in shaping our actions, even if it doesn't initiate them.
So my brain might be drawing up the blueprints, but my conscious mind gets to approve the final design. I like that it gives me back some agency.
Exactly. One way to think about it is that consciousness might act as a kind of filter or editor for the constant stream of impulses and desires bubbling up from our unconscious.
So instead of being at the mercy of every whim, our conscious mind can step in and say, nope, not going to do that today.
Precisely. It's like having a wise editor reviewing a manuscript,
Yeah.
making sure the final product is coherent, aligned with our values, and ultimately something we can stand behind.
Okay.
And that's where things get really interesting because this editorial role of consciousness might actually be strengthened by understanding these unconscious influences.
Okay, so how does understanding that my brain is working behind the scenes actually give me more control? That seems counterintuitive.
Think of it this way. The more aware we are of the unconscious biases, habits, and impulses that can influence our behavior, the better equipped we are to recognize them and potentially challenge them.
So knowledge is power. If I know my brain has a tendency to say, reach for that cookie without even asking me, maybe I can start to anticipate that urge and make a different choice.
Exactly. And not just with cookies, but with all sorts of decisions and behaviors. By shining a light on these unconscious processes, we can start to make them conscious, and in doing so, gain more agency over our actions.
It's like my brain might be a master of disguise, but once I know its tricks, I can start to see through them.
Precisely. And that's where tools like mindfulness, self-reflection, and even therapy can be incredibly valuable. They help us become more aware of our thoughts, feelings, and motivations, both conscious and unconscious, allowing us to make more intentional choices.
So we're not just puppets at the mercy of our brains. We have the ability to become more conscious participants in the dance. I like that analogy.
Me too. And it's a dance we'll be exploring further in our next section because
Huh.
this brings us to some cutting-edge research using brain imaging to literally predict choices before they're consciously made.
Whoa, now you're really speaking my language. Brain scans predictions. This is getting good, but we'll have to save that for part 3. Don't touch the dial, listeners. Things are about to get even wilder.
No.
All right, brain scam enthusiast prediction junkies. We're back for the grand finale.
Right.
We've gone deep into the Libet experiment, questioned the very nature of free will,
Right.
and now are we saying science can actually see our decisions before we do?
Get ready for the brain-bending part because it's not just philosophy anymore. It's getting down to the nitty-gritty of neurons firing. Remember fMRI, that fancy brain scanning technique we touched on earlier?
Oh yeah, like a high-resolution snapshot of my brain deciding between pizza toppings.
Exactly. Except now imagine researchers can use that data to predict with surprising accuracy which topping your brain is leaning towards, even before you're consciously aware of making a choice. It's like they're peeking at your brain's order before it reaches the kitchen.
Okay, hold the phone. You're telling me they can see my pizza preferences forming in my brain before I even know what I'm craving. How is that even possible?
It all comes down to patterns of activity. When you make a decision, even a seemingly simple one like choosing pizza toppings,
Right.
different brain regions light up,
Yep.
areas involved in memory sensory processing, weighing options. Researchers have found that by analyzing these patterns, they can start to decode what your brain is up to, often before you're consciously aware of the decision itself.
So it's like my brain is having a whole internal debate, pepperoni versus mushrooms, and these stands are picking up on the arguments happening in different corners of my head.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that these predictions aren't just about simple choices, like food. Researchers have used fMRI to predict things like whether someone will buy a product they're viewing,
Wow.
which direction they'll move in a virtual environment,
Okay.
even whether they'll cooperate or compete in a game.
Whoa, this is next level stuff.
Hey.
But doesn't this bring us back to that unsettling feeling of like, do we really have free will if our brains are making these decisions before we are?
It's a question that continues to fascinate and challenge us.
Right.
But I think it's important to remember that prediction isn't the same as predetermination.
Okay.
Just because we can identify patterns in brain activity that precede a decision doesn't mean the outcome is set in stone.
So my brain might be biased towards pepperoni based on past pizza experiences, but that doesn't mean I'm destined to order it every time. There's still room for me, the conscious pizza enthusiast, to override that impulse.
Absolutely. In fact, some studies have shown that when people are made aware of their brain's predictions, they can actually change their behavior. It's like, oh, you think you know me, brain? I'll show you.
I like that. So we're not powerless bystanders in our own decision-making processes. We have the ability to observe, to reflect, and yes, even to rebel against those unconscious biases and tendencies.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's where this whole conversation takes on a more empowering light. It's not about denying the influence of our unconscious minds,
Right.
but rather about understanding them better so we can make more informed and intentional choices.
Okay, so big takeaway time. We've covered a lot of ground here, from finger wiggles to pizza toppings to mind-blowing brain scans. What's the key message you want our listeners to walk away with today?
I think the most important message is that our understanding of the mind is constantly evolving. The Libet experiment, for all its limitations, was a landmark moment because it forced us to confront this idea that our conscious experience might not be the whole story.
Yeah, that our brains are these incredible multi-layered systems with a lot more going on beneath the surface than we often realize.
Exactly. And as we develop more sophisticated tools for studying the brain, who knows what other surprises we'll uncover.
It's both humbling and incredibly exciting. So to our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and maybe even order a different pizza topping next time just to prove your brain wrong.
And if you do, make sure you savor every bite, because even that enjoyment is the result of a complex dance between conscious and unconscious processes, a dance we're only just beginning to understand.
Beautifully said. That's a wrap on today's deep dive. We'll catch you next time when we tackle another listener-submitted mystery of the mind. Until then, keep those neurons firing.